Welcome to another episode in our debut Spotlight series, where we shine the light on the freshest authors and their work. Today, the spotlight is on Lucy Steeds and her debut novel, The Artist. Set in Provence in 1920, The Artist tells the story of Joseph, an aspiring journalist who has been invited to the home of artist Edouard Tartuffe, a reclusive painter, and his niece, Etty. Joseph believes that an interview with Tartuffe will be his key to success, but the more time he spends at the farmhouse, the secrets he uncovers are beyond anything he'd ever anticipated. And after years spent hiding behind her uncle's genius, Etty is ready to be seen. Lucy Steeds is a writer based between London and Amsterdam. She has a BA in English Literature and a Master's in World Literatures from the University of Oxford. Lucy is a graduate of both the Faber Academy and the London Library Emerging Writers Programme. In manuscript form, her debut novel, The Artist, has already been listed for the BPA First Novel Award, the Yeovil Literary Prize, the Page Turner Award, the Fiction Factory First Chapter Competition, and was a finalist in the Spotlight First Novel Award. The Artist is out now and published by John Murray, and here to chat all about it, welcome, Lucy, to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on. I am delighted to chat. I think I have seen The Artist everywhere recently. It feels like the debut of the moment. So I'm very excited to have you. And I saw your post on Instagram about the launch party that you had, which looked absolutely insane. How was that?
That was really fun. So that was a surprise for me, to be honest, because my publicity and marketing team did such a great job. There were so many surprises for me on the day. So I just sort of rocked up to do my thing, which was a sort of Q&A with my editor and then sign loads of books. But the whole of the rest of the event, they had just like decked out Waterstones with like color by numbers book cover. So everyone was just like tea in the corner. It looked like a really good party. I was signing books for the entire evening. I don't know what happened. I was just like looking across at this room and I was like, it looks really fun. I would like to be there, but I was just
slowly dissociating while you sign your name over and over.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, yes. You have to like design a signature that you can do, repeatedly, multiple times over and over again. But yeah, that was really fun. It went by in a complete blur, but I had a really good time. I just doing this kind of Q&A with my editor. So we were really getting into the book. But obviously at that launch, there were like some people who were just there because they love books and wanted to hear about it. And then there were just like members of my family and friends who don't really like, people who read like maybe one book a year. Yeah. And I was really inside baseball about my book. And I was like, maybe I should just zone back a little bit.
I love that. It's the same with my family, that my sister's got back into reading recently, so she's reading quite a lot, but the rest of my family are like, why do you have so many books? Like, when do you have time to read? And I'm like, it's not this like weird thing that you think it is. Like,
like this weird niche hobby you have.
Yeah, it's like so strange to them. And I'm like, well, when you're watching telly all the time, like I'm reading, like it's just a different thing that I use my time for. Like, it's not strange.
It's really, for me, it's really useful to remember, because I think when you're quite deep within the publishing industry, you get really obsessed with all these tiny, all the tiny facets and all the tiny details. And every like minor thing you can obsess over, you find yourself able to do that. But then occasionally I talk to people, who work in completely different fields. And if I say I've written a book, their first question is often, if I say I've written a novel, they go, oh, is it fiction or nonfiction? And that's always such a humbling moment, because I'm like, oh, people don't care or no.
Yeah.
Like, most people really don't know what you do.
No, they don't understand it.
It's really healthy. So whenever I'm, again, obsessing over commas, I'm just like, most people don't care. It's fine.
Or they want to know like where they can find it. They're like, oh, will it be in my bookshop? And you're like,
I'm like,
probably.
And just, if not, then you can ask for it. Just go in shop and ask them to order it for you.
So we are here to chat about your book, but before we get into that, I love to ask authors what they're currently reading. So could you tell us?
I am currently reading The Rabbit Hutch.
I've seen a lot about this.
Oh, it's so good. Okay, so The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. It is set in the fictional town of Vacaville, Indiana. Tess Gunty is from Indiana. And it's this kind of abandoned Rust Belt town. And the whole book is this polyphonic novel. So it's told through multiple people's perspectives and voices. And they're linked together by the fact that they all live in the same apartment block. And Tess Gunty just does this brilliant thing where you have all these voices which are completely distinct. And it's about all these lives sort of rubbing together and the way these people live on top of each other and next to each other. And some of them intersect and some of them interact and some of them just don't. But she takes this idea of they all live in the same apartment block. What can link them? And you just follow these characters in this sort of abandoned Rust Belt town. And a lot of the characters you follow are these teenagers who have just aged out of the foster system. So there's this kind of parallel between this like abandoned town. The idea is that there was this automobile plant, which then shut up shop. So there's like a huge amount of unemployment in the town now. And then these abandoned teenagers who are sort of out of the foster system. But again, what are they doing with their lives? And they are so much fun. There's one of the main characters is Blondine, and she's this really cool, spiky, energetic character, and she's just obsessed with 15th century German mystic Hildegard von Bingen. So like it's like all these really fun characters where it's just like you get to be in their head for a little bit and then you jump into another one, and then it's sort of like 3 days over a hot crackling summer. As you can tell, I like books that are hot crackling summer books, and this is a really good one.
That sounds really good. I feel like it came out a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, it did. It's so surprising. Her writing is really good. Like every chapter, she's one of those writers where you feel really confident that she will get you to the end of the novel in good shape and she's going to take you on a ride, and you don't really know necessarily where you're going. In each chapter you sort of begin it and you're like, what's going on here? This is like each one's a little bit different, but you just have complete faith that she will get you to the end of this book and you'll have had a wild ride from start to finish.
I love that. That sounds so good. Let's talk about your journey as a writer, because your book is now out in the world, and I don't know how that feels for you, but what has it been like from the initial idea for this book to getting it out into the world? Like, how has that process been for you?
Mind-boggling, as
Yes.
as you can imagine. I actually feel a lot better now that it's out in the world in physical form, because for so long this book was a Word document on my laptop, and then it existed in a kind of nebulous form in emails, and now it's finally a book, and it's just like, okay, that was the thing I was aiming for all this time. Now it's a book in bookshops. So in terms of seed to plant, I guess the idea had been brewing in my head for a while, and I've always written. I've always been someone who's scribbling things, usually like on my commute in the notes app on my phone, just like darting things down in like these snatches of time. And I just had this feeling that writing was what I wanted to do. It's what I feel I'm best at. And I just had this feeling of I will always be doing it in snatches of stolen time unless I do something radical and really just like devote a chunk of time to it. So I gave myself a year, and I was like, I'm going to take a year. And in this year, I'm going to throw everything I have at writing just to see, because I was like, I just want to know what happens, because otherwise I'm going to do it when I retire. And I don't want to wait that long.
No.
So I had this thing of, if I throw everything I have at writing and really just like saying no to social events, just like head down, working hard, what happens? And at least then, if I don't get anywhere, then at least I'll know. I'll know that it's not for lack of time and work thrown at it. So I gave myself a year to write a novel. I signed up to the Faber Academy and got in, which was amazing. And that was such a good way of structuring my year. Because I think if I'd had this sort of unwieldy year just to manage by myself, I'm not sure how I would have done it. But the Faber Academy was brilliant because it basically gave me a deadline every 2 weeks. And that meant I had to produce new work every 2 weeks. And I'm a real perfectionist and a real tinkerer. Like, I can move commas around for a whole day, and that's I love that. But having deadlines every 2 weeks meant I had to produce new work, and I couldn't keep sort of looking over my shoulder at what I'd just done and sort of perfecting things. I had to move forward, which for me was so good. So I did that for a year. I gave myself the sort of self-imposed deadline of having a full manuscript by the end of the 9-month Faber course. Then I spent the summer editing it. And again, this very arbitrary thing of I gave myself a year, I then had to send the manuscript out because I was just like, I need to know what happens. So I sent it out to agents, and it was only when I was signing the contract with my agent that I noticed the date was exactly 1 year to the day I'd given myself. So that felt like it took exactly 1 year, and then I signed with an agent, and I was like, okay, this feels like a little nudge from the universe.
That's amazing.
So that was a real year of like, I'm gonna try this, see what happens. And then it got somewhere, and then I edited my manuscript with my agent for a couple of months. Didn't need a huge amount of editing, but I really loved working with her. My agent, Eleanor, is amazing. And I think we work really well together because she basically took my manuscript and her way of editing. Agents like vary quite a lot in terms of how editorial they are, but she has a really good way of working, which suits me, where she took my manuscript and then just said, here are my questions. You don't have to answer them, but here are about, it was like 8 quite big questions. And she said, you can answer these questions by ignoring them completely, by explaining something to me or in the manuscript, or by changing something in the manuscript. See what you want to do. Just here are my questions. And that was good because I then had to go in and decide what I wanted to do to the manuscript. And then we sort of sent it back and forth and worked on that. And then, Eleanor sent it out to publishers and it sort of took off from there. That was quite a nice bit because it was like, Eleanor, this is your job now. I've
Please take it.
as good as I can make it. Now you have to find me a publisher. And she, yes, definitely did that brilliantly.
That's amazing. As I said, I've seen your book everywhere in the last couple of weeks, so clearly it's working. And this thing that you spent a year, scribbling away on, yeah, it's gone out into the world and it's doing what Etty's done and it's setting the world on fire. So I'm so happy for you that it's already doing so well.
Yeah, that's the thing. I always have to remind myself, like, it's so nice to know that it is out there and that people are reading it, but for me, the only bit I can control is writing it. The only bit I can do is writing the book. And yeah, if it's out there, then that's really props to my brilliant publisher. But I think I need to always remember, like, my job is writing and the relationship I can control is the one between me and the page. And that's sort of it.
Let's get into your novel because I absolutely loved this book and there's so much to talk about and we probably won't have enough time to chat about everything that I'd like to. But I want to start, before we quite get into the novel, you include these 2 wonderful quotes in your epigraph. And I particularly loved the Celia Paul one. I don't know if you have your copy to hand. You do. Of course you do.
That's very so the quote from Celia Paul is, I mislead him and do not tell him the truth because by lying I can dance in and out of the prison bars.
I love that so much. It's one of those things where you read and you're like, I just need to take a moment to absorb that because it was just so brilliant. And once you've read the book, you kind of think, gosh, wow, yeah, that is such a great, both of those quotes in the epigraph just make so much sense for your book.
I'm so glad they were real beacons while I was writing.
Yes, I can imagine. What was it about those quotes? Now we have to keep it spoiler free, but what was it about those quotes that really resonated with you, do you think?
Oh, so I collect quotes anyway. Whenever I'm writing, whenever I'm working, if I find a quote or I'm reading something and something jumps out at me, I will write that down. So I had a long list of possible epigraphs for this book.
I love this.
I returned to. So briefly, Celia Paul, for those who might not know, Celia Paul is an artist and she's a brilliant artist. She does the most incredible paintings. They're very raw and vibrant, have a lot of emotion in them. But for a long time, Celia Paul was just known as Lucian Freud's girlfriend, and he treated her pretty awfully. That's what this book, Self-Portrait, is about. It's about sort of her as an artist and then her being perceived as just sort of Lucian Freud's girlfriend very often. So I had this playing about in my mind, which is just like, how do we think about women artists and how should we? And I loved this thing where she was just like, deception helps me achieve freedom. I really liked that idea about how by lying, she can dance out of her prison bars. And then the second epigraph to the book is one by John Berger. John Berger's Ways of Seeing is such a good essay on looking at art. It's quite brief and it's really fun. But the quote I took from that is where he says, we only see what we look at. To look is an act of choice. And this I really loved because it's this idea of you can point your eyes at something and you think of it. Whereas if you look at it from a different angle, you might see something else. And this idea of what you point your eyes at is a choice. And you can sort of like apply that to so many things. But I loved it in terms of art and also people and women and how they exist in society and the way we look at them and the way they sort of slip into roles that we just want them to be in. So I had these 2 epigraphs playing around each other. And the novel is told from 2 different perspectives. You have Joseph's perspective and you have Etty's perspective. And for me, these 2 epigraphs sort of represented that as well. You have John Berger and then you have Celia Paul, so a man's perspective and a woman's perspective, and they sort of loop around each other. I really liked the interplay between them. And something I was always trying to do was that thing that Berger talks about, where if you look at something, you are missing something. You are by definition missing out on seeing it from another angle. And I wanted the book to feel like that. So you read these chapters, and the reason I really like the fact that it's told from two perspectives is often you see Joseph and Etty's perspective on the same thing, and you realize there is a gap. There is something missing between what he's seeing and what she's seeing. And the book is sort of closing that gap until their perspectives just collide at the end. So yeah, I was interested in the gap between what people see and how I could sort of represent that in a novel.
Yeah, I was really curious actually about, because you have three characters in this book, as I mentioned in my intro, but like you said, you only choose to give the perspectives of Etty and Joseph. Which voice of them came to you first, and why the choice to leave Tartuffe's perspective out of the book?
Oh, I actually wrote a chapter from his perspective. And
Did you? I
had so
love
much fun
that.
writing it. It was really fun. But in the end, I was just like, he is this dominant force, and by stripping him of a voice, I'm taking away a little bit of his power. He's a real tyrant in this book, and I need to sort of dethorn that.
Yes.
I take away a little bit of his power. And also, I really like the interplay of Joseph and Etty's perspectives. Interestingly, that was what cracked the book open for me. So I originally just wrote it from Joseph's perspective. And as I would think, I don't know if you write, but I could feel something wasn't right. I was like, I get this nagging feeling that I'm not quite telling the story how I'm meant to. And then I remember vividly waking up, and I remember my bedroom I was in at the time. I remember just waking up and being like, I've realized what I need to do. And it was to tell it from two perspectives, which is a horrible moment when you're writing, when you suddenly realize you need to undo what you've done and rewrite it in a radically different mode. And it was this moment where I just knew either this is going to solve it or it's going to ruin it. And I can only find out by doing it. So again, I rewrote it from Joseph and Etty's perspective. And that's when it took off. That's when I was suddenly like, oh, okay, we're in our groove. We're going. It works now. Because I suddenly had this sort of sneaky extra perspective where like Etty's voice is so much fun to write in. I had so much fun with her because I would have, in a way, loved to have written the book just from her perspective. But she is the holder of so many secrets. She holds all these mysteries. It would have been a real challenge to write a novel where you are on this voyage of discovery into working out what her secrets are if you're in her head the whole time, because then you just know. So by having Joseph's very innocent perspective versus Etty's very sneaky, secretive one, those were really good to play against each other. Because I think if you had just been in sort of Etty's quite spiky, secretive head the whole time, it would have got a bit frustrating. Or if you were only in Joseph's very sort of naive one, you'd feel that there was something missing. But by playing them off against each other, I really had fun. And again, Etty's sections are so much fun. There's like an Etty chapter that's just a sentence. It's just
I love that you did that. Yeah, I thought it was so much fun and really playful with the way that you wrote her perspectives. I absolutely loved Etty as a character. And there's so much that I could lean into with Etty, but I do want to touch on what you were just speaking about, which is to do with women living in the shadow of famous male artists and creators, which we hear so much about, but so much of Etty's life in this book is sort of based around her uncle's life is her life, and she has to make everything just so that, you know, he can do his work and he can create his genius. And it's a phenomenon that I knew about, but I hadn't fully looked into. And I had a little look online yesterday, and I found this great website for listeners to look at, which I will link in the show notes. It's lostwomenart.de, so I will link that. But I'm curious, Lucy, what ignited your passion to write about a woman like Etty?
So I was thinking about art monsters, which is this kind of phrase for exactly what you're talking about. These domineering, tyrannical figures who are sort of, you know, figures of genius, and they writers or artists. And the argument about art monsters is always that, yeah, they're these pretty awful people, but they create great works of art. And it's this thing of just like, well, we have to excuse their tyrannical, awful behavior because we wouldn't have art otherwise. So I was thinking a lot about Nabokov, who wrote Lolita. And Nabokov used to boast that his wife, Vera, would lick his stamps for him and fold his umbrella for him. And you just get this impression when you read him of like, he's this genius creating admittedly very good books, but he can do that because he knows there is someone to clean up after him, someone to cook his meals, someone to raise his children, someone to lick his stamps for him. And this ties into this argument of, yes, but would we have Lolita if he wasn't able to just be this tyrant and be this art monster? And I was sort of so much less interested in the argument of think of all the art we've gained from these people than think of all the art we've lost. I was like, but what could Vera Nabokov have written if she had not been licking his stamps?
Mm-hmm.
And all of these women who have sort of been trodden on and stamped down, what could they have created if they had had time? And I find it so interesting, the gendered aspect of these art monsters. It's historically been incredibly gendered, where women have been running around after these men. And I just wanted to say, what have we lost? I'm not really interested in what we've gained. I'm interested in what could have been. And so I wanted to dig into that sort of underside. And again, that's where Celia Poole was really helpful for me. And I liked this idea of sort of thinking about secrecy as a form of power.
Mm.
So I was thinking about how, I mean, a secret is just knowledge. It's just knowledge that you have and someone else doesn't have. And knowledge is power. So I wanted to write a book where secrecy is a form of power and this kind of dark side of deception can actually be a form of freedom. And I really liked that. And it was a really fun mode to write in where Etty's power comes from her secrets.
I can't stop thinking about, now that you've said it, I didn't know this about Nabokov, and I can't stop thinking about the fact that this woman had to be so readily available to put down his umbrella.
Yeah.
Like the fact that you have to be hovering around the house in order to scurry over and take that off somebody as soon as they enter, that's crazy to me. And you're right.
This great man bursting through the door, throwing down his umbrella,
Yeah.
just knocking things over. And I sort of wanted to have that impression of this big, physically large and sort of atmospherically large figure and the wake of destruction they leave in a house. And that was also quite a conscious decision. So the novel is just set in one house. We don't really leave that house. And Tartuffe is a recluse, but he is also the tyrannical ruler of this house. So he's sort of removed from society, but he's put himself in a location where he has complete power and control over this one setting. And it was a really fun experiment to just set the novel in this one house and build this sense of claustrophobia, because by the end, the character's wanting to break out of this house. And I wanted that feeling for the reader as well, where it's like, you just want to leave this house after this hot, sticky summer where the tension has been ramping up, the temperature's been increasing. By the end, you're like, I need to get out of this house. And I wanted that feeling to just sort of be like ripping itself out of the book by the end.
It does feel incredibly claustrophobic. And of course, an element of that is a huge part of that is his presence that makes it feel so suffocating. You really get a sense of that. I want to talk about the era in which it's set in. So it's, as I said, it's in Provence in 1920. What drew you to writing about this particular era?
So the key was the art. I went through the art, which is, I just picked art I like, which is that sort of, I love the sort of post-impressionist-y, early 20th century art. And a lot of the post-impressionists worked in Provence in the south of France, because there is a quality to the light there. I don't know if you've ever been, but you're looking around, you'd be like, I can see why people painted this. There's something buttery and yellow and clear about the light down there. So I went in through the art. And for me, that was really helpful, because again, when I was writing, I would just sort of look at the art sometimes and it would feel like I was there even when I wasn't physically there. So that was a real key for me. I love the interwar period. I think it's such an interesting period that post World War I, the world is gone. That sense of people have emerged. Those who have survived the war are emerging, blinking into the world again. But the world they knew before the war is gone and it's never coming back. And they have to build the world anew. So what are they doing with it? And I never really thought I was writing a war book. It's not heavy on war. Don't worry, guys. Um,
It's not.
I
I'm
never.
not a fan of heavy war stuff, and this was not it. So
Yeah,
I
but the
can.
more I wrote into 1920, the more I was like, oh, the war's not over. The war is still
Mm,
here in these little pockets, and the scars are still visible on people's minds, on their bodies. And I wanted to feel around that and sort of see the sort of long shadow of World War One and the ways it manifests itself. And yeah, there's this quote I really like, which is something like the people who emerged sort of after World War One were sort of broken and traumatized on one hand, but hungry for freedom and pleasure on the other. And that was a contrast I really liked. I like contrasts in general. And the contrast between the broken, traumatized, destroyed world and just this feeling of, well, the world's gone, we better have a good time. And this sort of like hedonistic, it's the sort of fertile ground for the roaring 20s where people are just like, we have to make the world new, what are we going to do? And that sort of very sensual living for pleasure. And I really like the contrast between creation and destruction. And so
mm.
positioning art and the war in sort of opposition to each other, I wanted to sort of look at a large scale destruction and then sort of private act of creation. And the war was an interesting one as well, because without giving too much spoilers, for one character in this book, the war is extremely traumatic. And for the other, it's a chance to grab a little bit of freedom. It's like a terrible time, but they grasp a little bit more of life than they previously would have. So I think it's a real time of upheaval and change. And I wanted to sort of, again, just look at these three characters, shake them around a bit and see what happened.
I don't know if this is treading on spoiler territory, so please tell me if it is, and we can get rid of this part. But I wanted to touch on a thread in the book which I was really interested in, and it's to do with the war. And I don't think I've read much about this in fiction before, and it's of someone being an objector to war and choosing not to participate because they don't like the concept of war, and they don't want to have to fight, and they don't want to, that's kind of, yeah, what an objector is. But and it's probably, yeah, I've probably made it sound really basic and it's, it's much more than that. Why did you want to represent that experience?
So, in general, I wanted to touch on World War One, but I didn't want to put the reader in a trench. I was like,
Yes,
we're
so
going to
fair.
do World War One, we're not going into trenches. So, from the very beginning, I was like, what are the sort of more peripheral stories of World War One? How did it manifest? And the sort of things I touch on are, yes, as you said, a conscientious objector, a nurse with no medical experience whatsoever, Algerian conscripts into the French army, and traumatized people with sort of what they call shell shock that we'd call PTSD now.
Hmm.
So those are the stories I was more interested in. And the conscientious objection, I find it really interesting because from a very like from just the individual, i.e. Joseph's perspective, saying no to a war is not a shameful thing. I mean, it's saying no to death and it's saying yes to life. It's running
Yeah.
away from death, which in
Hmm.
any other context is a good thing. And running towards life and saying, I don't want to kill people or be killed in any other context is an admirable thing to do. So I was very interested in this context where actually the context of war changes that for a lot of people. And that's that strange line between cowardice and bravery where actually you do have to be brave enough to say, I don't want to. So if hordes of young men are signing up, you have to be brave enough to say, I'm going to ostracize myself and not
Yes, yeah.
do. So I really wanted to sort of, yeah, explore that perspective. There's some really good literature about it. So Regeneration by Pat Barker, she fictionalizes Siegfried Sassoon when he is in hospital recovering from some horrendous traumas from World War One. He writes these very anti-war, I can't remember if it's poems or pamphlets, but he basically is very anti-war and sort of becomes a pacifist through having fought in World War One, just saying you are sending thousands of men to just be ritually slaughtered. And the idea that that's a radical thing to say
Yeah.
is, yeah, it's a perspective I wanted to inhabit for a little bit. So I really liked that. And then I wanted, so Joseph again, this thing of having run away from the war, having not participated in it, then what can I give him? How can I give him something to run towards? Because I think if you're running away from something, you are by definition running towards something else. So I made him run towards art and life in the south of France, and I wanted to see what he found there.
And I think art is used as this, it has this real healing power for a lot of the characters in the book. Really careful on spoilers on how it, how it heals people, but it's so interesting how much of a powerful tool it is in this book. And I was curious about that because it sounds like your background is quite heavy with art, but I obviously don't know. So yeah, where does that love for art come from with you?
I've just always loved it and felt very drawn towards it. And so I grew up in London, and I think one of the best things about growing up in London is all of the greatest art is free. You can walk into the National Gallery, you can walk into the National Portrait Gallery, it's free. So still, I do this. If I'm like early for meeting a friend, I'll just spend half an hour looking at some of the most amazing paintings in the world.
I love
So
that.
it's so good. And embedding it in your daily life like that is such a privilege and such a wonderful thing to do. But I was really raised in a way that so I think a lot of people are often intimidated by art because
Mm.
sometimes, when you go to a gallery and you're like, am I appreciating this properly? And you spend the whole time worrying that you are not appreciating the art properly or not understanding it. Whereas I grew up with this sort of attitude towards art, which was, look at it. Do you like it? If not, move on. That's fine. And not to worry about understanding it or whether I was sort of intellectually appreciating each bit. It was just point your eyes at it, enjoy it. If not, that's fine. And take what you need from art. So I put that into the book. I gave that to Joseph's mother because I was like, it's such a freeing and ultimately the most important part of art, which is it's for you. I don't think people ever create art with a desire for it to be exclusive. I don't think artists ever make their art and be like, I hope people don't understand this. They
Mm.
are making art because they want to connect with people. So the idea that you would then be intimidated by it or sort of look at it in a way that you think it's not for you is, yeah, so sad. So I really wanted to have this concept of art being for you. I think art is for everyone. And if you look at something and love it, that's brilliant. But also, if you look at something and it means nothing to you, that's so fine. That's completely fine. And that's not a feeling on your part or on the art's part. It just means that, yeah, the alchemical thing between you two hasn't happened. But just move on, go into the next room, see what's in there. And so I really wanted, yeah, that sort of aspect of just art's really fun. It's really good. It's really fun. Enjoy it. And don't worry if you don't, that's also completely fine. So I've always just loved pointing my eyes at art in the book. So I I was very conscious when I was writing the book about art that I didn't want to write a novel about art that was annoying. I was like, it could be so easy to make this annoying for people who don't like art. So it needed to work on two levels. It needs to work for people who love art and also people who know nothing about art, who don't really care about it, and who've never really thought about it before. I was like, it needs to work for those people as well. It cannot just be a book for people who know what sort of like know loads or like it already. I needed it to work on both levels. So I was very clear from the beginning. I don't use technical language. I don't say fauvism or cubism or words like that. I never describe a painting by saying, oh, it looks post-impressionist, because if you don't know what that looks like, that's such a waste of a word on the page.
Mm.
And I never wanted to waste any words. So the idea of, for example, describing a painting as looking cubist, unless you know what cubist paintings are, it's just a useless thing to just say. So I never do that. I never drop artists' names in a way that you need to know anything about them. There are some fun cameos occasionally, but always I did it in the spirit of, if you don't know who this person is, the book still works. And
Yes.
it needs to ultimately just be a good story, and the art is a sort of fun layer of discovery on top. You definitely don't need to know about art already.
Mhm.
And I really thought about it very carefully when I was describing paintings in the book, because again, that thing about being annoying, I was like, I'm a very visual reader and a very
Mm.
visual writer, and I'm so aware that not everyone is. So I was like, I don't want to write a book that only works for me and other people who can picture things in their head. The book needs to work if you cannot picture things. So very quickly, I realized that if I'm describing paintings, it is virtually useless to describe a painting by saying there's a bit of blue in the top left-hand corner and then there's a bit of red. Because if you can't picture that, it means nothing. And again, your eyes will just glaze over on the page. So I had to find a way of describing paintings that meant something to people who don't visualize things. So I used to just go to galleries, plonk myself down in front of a painting and just free write. I don't know if you ever do this, but the writing where you're The idea is you connect your pen to page and you just write. You do not stop, you do not look back, you do not self-edit, you just keep going. And I would sort of fill my eyes with these paintings and just write whatever came to my head. And that's where some of my most interesting writing came from. And I found that when I did that, the things I wrote, it was never, there is some blue in the top left-hand corner. It was always so much more about like the texture or the sort of movement of the paint or the crunchiness or the sort of slick oiliness of the impasto. It's like all these things where that made it into the book. And I suddenly realized, okay, the way to describe a painting is just by sort of flooding the senses. And going in through the emotions about how the painting makes you feel was often a really good way as well. So my biggest hope is that the book works on two levels. So if you love art, it's going to be a great time for you. And also if you know nothing about art, this is still a really fun book.
I feel like I sort of sit in the middle and I don't have a great understanding of art. Like I probably couldn't name like a ton of artists, and I definitely wouldn't understand if you were using the terms that you were using before, where you're saying like, you know, it's something somebody says like, oh, it's postmodern or it's impressionist. I don't know if you said that, but I don't understand all those terms, but I can appreciate art and look at it and, you know that I'm feeling a certain type of way about it and know that there are certain colours or textures that I might be more drawn to than others. And that's probably the extent of, but I'm very willing to go to galleries and absorb it and enjoy it. So it's really funny, and I really loved that you have this moment where Joseph is reflecting on his time with his mum and her, you know, telling him. I've actually highlighted that quote.
Oh, I love
Um, he says, the greatest lesson his mother taught him was not to worry about understanding art. Just let it wash over you, she used to say. Don't worry about what it means. Just look and take whatever you need from it. And then he goes on to talk about how she's the one that introduced him to the work of Tartuffe. And she says again, sorry, when they're looking at his paintings, how does it make you feel? What do you think it means? And it's, you know, it's not an intellectual sort of study of Tartuffe's art. It's about looking at it and really seeing it for what it is, and how does it make you feel? And it's not sort of an intellectual, the intellectual doesn't really come into it when they're talking about art. It's more of an emotional kind of thing, and I just really love that, because that's how I've kind of come to art, is that I don't have this intellectual understanding of it, but I have this, I'm kind of moved by art in an emotional sense.
Well, that's the main point. I mean, there's no exam at the end of
Yeah.
no test. And I think often the way people talk about art as if there is an exam.
Yes.
It's like, guys, there's no exam. You just look at it and feel things. And that's really it. And the more you can feel able to do that, the better. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that comes across in the book. And I, again, wanted to sort of dig into it through Joseph and Etty's perspectives, where Joseph is trying to write about art. He's trying to sort of write his article about the things that Tata is painting. And he says to Etty, he's just like, but what does it mean? And she's like, it doesn't matter. She's like, don't worry about that. It's sort of beside the point. And I feel that with the book as well. People are often just like, oh, what does this mean? I'm like, whatever you want it to mean. It means one thing to me, but I'm very big on the book is for the readers now. And whatever each reader takes from it is as valid a reading as whatever I put into it. And there's one set of meanings that I get from it, but every reader has their own, and they're as valid as mine, to be honest.
There's so much in the book that feels very visceral, and it's not just the art. There's so much kind of longing and yearning in the book, and it feels like tricky spoiler territory to talk about that, but it's such a sensory experience reading this book. And I think probably my safest direction to go into, aside from touching on the fact that there is a lot of longing and yearning, which I thought was really beautiful, I think we can talk about food, because food is another thing that feels very sensory, and you write about it so well. And food in this book is a source of anxiety, is a source of art, is a source of greed. There's kind of so much to it. You know, it can be used as a weapon at times, as something to kind of be withheld or wasted. Could you tell us about your exploration of food in this story?
I love that you've asked about this. So writing a novel is very exposing, because some of the things people have said, people are often like, there's loads of food in this book. And I'm like, yeah, like a normal amount, like a regular amount that someone's thinking about food, right? And they're like, no, There's an
Well,
obscene
me, yes, I am.
amount.
I will ask my boyfriend as soon as we get off this call what we're having for tea. So I am somebody that I'm on side with you on this.
Like, it's a completely regular amount that someone's thinking about food. Apparently it's not.
Yeah,
So food is a really interesting way of showing character very often because your characters in general have to eat 3 meals a day. It's something they're doing anyway. And you can tell so much from what people eat, how they eat it, do they share it? Are they the one who've cooked it? And so I really like it as a way of sort of just like revealing bits about people. And the thing about Tartuffe in the book is he takes people's plates. If he wants to paint it when you're halfway through your meal, he will just take it and paint it.
that
And
made
that
me so anxious.
I know, same, obviously. So I loved using food as a sort of like way to play around with the characters. And a really key part of the book is that they only eat food that you can paint. So when they buy food, it has to have interesting shapes and interesting colors and interesting textures. And they have to arrange them on plates in a way that you would want to paint. And it has to be not necessarily stuff that tastes nice. It has to sort
Mm.
of just be visually compelling. So one of the really we did a lot of edits on this book, and one of the really fun rounds of edits between me and my editor was the "Is this food in season?" edit, where we went through every single item of food mentioned, and my editor was just like, it has to be in season in the summer in France. And if not, why are they eating it? How are they getting it? So I had like quinces and figs at one point because I was like, beautiful, really good shapes and colors. And my editor was like, no, not in season, get them out. So I had to like cut those away. And then there was one which was oysters.
Mm.
And famously, you cannot eat oysters in the summer. But I was like, but they're really good to paint. And my editor was just like, you have to take them out. You cannot eat oysters in the summer. And this is where editing is quite fun because the solution to you can't eat oysters in the summer is just get rid of the oysters. Or it is keep the oysters in and give everyone food poisoning. Which
Exactly.
is what I did in the end. Because I was just like, can't think of a food I want to replace the oysters with. I'm going to keep them in and just there's this really good writing advice, which is to hang a lantern on your plot problems. I.e., if you've got a plot problem and you're like, I don't know how to get around it, you shine a really big lantern on it and you illuminate it. And you say, I know this is a problem. I know you can't eat oysters in the summer. That's why everyone's throwing up. And so it's sort of like a way of getting around that. But it was really good because then it added into this uncomfortable feeling that Joseph has in this house where he's like, his body is literally allergic to this house. He's sort of like sweating, so sticky, throwing up, having a horrible time. And going back to that idea of contrasts, I really liked the idea of setting a book in the south of France during the summer. And most people are like, lovely, delicious. That's great. And I'm like, no, it's going to be horrible. It's going to be horrible. It's going to be so sticky. I wanted that feeling of, sometimes in the summer when like every part of your body is sweating, like your shins are sweating, and you're just like, I will never be comfortable again. I want to peel my own skin off. I
Yeah.
wanted that horrible summer feeling, and just to sort of ramp that up throughout the book. So by the end, you're like, the air is so thick, there are flies everywhere, again, from all this rotting food, and this sort of sense of physical discomfort where the farmhouse where the story takes place, it begins as an Eden. It begins as this sort of beautiful paradise for Joseph. And by the end, it's just this place he needs to escape from. It's this sort of turning of something glorious and wonderful, and things is like an escape for him. And by the end, he's like, I need to peel this house from my body. I need to
Yeah.
like get out of it physically.
I have noticed that we are running out of time, which is very distressing because there's so much that I could speak about. And I am going to be really sneaky because, as I said before, that there is so much longing and yearning in the book that I would love to chat about, but it would be terrible spoiler territory. There is a moment where Etty says that she's kind of unsure about her understanding of what love is. And I think it's because of how her life's been up to this point. What do you think love is, Lucy?
Oh my gosh. For me, love is something that makes your world bigger. It's something that only ever makes life more technicolor and sweet tasting and enlarging. I never really understand, when people are like, love is pain, love is torture. I'm like, no, it isn't.
No, it
That's
shouldn't
love, if
be.
that's what you're talking about. Love is expansive and love is brilliant and it just makes your world bigger. And I do think that's in the book. I think love is the thing that makes her world bigger. I think it's something that gives her a life bigger than that one house. And with Etty as well, I wanted to sort of explore this idea of her understanding of the world is not normal. If you
Mm.
had lived under the thumb of one man in one house your entire life, you don't have a normal understanding of how the world works or how people work or anything really. And I sort of didn't want to just give her a very regular perspective and say, oh, and she's quite miserable in this house. It's like, no, she's going to have a quite weird brain chemistry if that's how she's grown up. And then it's about how do you confront the world when you finally get to touch it.
I love that you had this beautiful answer prepared. You didn't know I was going to ask that, but you had it ready.
Spoke from the heart.
I love that. It has been so lovely chatting to you, Lucy, about your wonderful book, The Artist. But I do like to finish on a recommendation. So is there anything, it can be books, art, TV, film, anything goes for this one. So what would you like to recommend?
Well, now you've said I can do art. My recommendation is go into a gallery, find one that's free if you are lucky enough to live somewhere where it's free. Because then sometimes I feel like, if you have to pay like 20 quid for an exhibition ticket, you're like, well, now there's a lot of pressure to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Go somewhere where the art is free, and like street art, that's often free. Go and just point your eyes at stuff and don't worry about what it means, whether you are understanding it, just enjoy it. And then, think about how you feel. In terms of a book recommendation, have you read this? Have you read Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead?
Yes, it's incredible.
It's so good. Okay, for those who have not read Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, I had heard amazing reviews about this for so long, and I sort of resisted reading it because I was like, oh, it's about airplanes. I was like, I'm not interested in airplanes. And then I read it, and I would say within 3 pages, I was like, I am the most interested in airplanes anyone has ever been. I was like, tell me more about aviation. So it is the story of a fictional female aviator, and she wants to circumnavigate the world in an airplane. And the book is just the entire story of her life, and it's so much fun. Every chapter is really short, really zippy, and you just sort of whoosh around with Marion Graves as fictional aviator. It's amazing. The writing is gorgeous because it's Maggie Shipstead. I had so much fun with this book. So if you have had this on your pile, but you've been like, well, I'm not interested in airplanes, you will be.
You're wrong. You're wrong about you will be interested. It's such a great book, and I absolutely loved it. And is it like 600 pages or something?
It doesn't feel like it.
It flies by. You feel completely immersed in this world, and you don't want to leave it. It's like sometimes you read a big book and you're like, oh, come on, but you don't get a sense of that at all. You don't want to leave this book. It's wonderful. Yeah. Great recommendation. Thank you so much, Lucy, for coming onto A Pair of Bookends. It's been a joy.
I've loved it. Thank you.
Yay. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe. For more content from us, you can find us via Patreon. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. Lucy, where can the listeners find you on social media?
The only thing I have is Instagram, and it's just my name, Lucy Steeds.
Lovely. Thank you so much again, Lucy, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Bye.
Bye.